Hello, everyone. I am Elliot Gaskin, Senior Vice President, Acting Chief Revenue Officer at Share Our Strength, and I want to welcome you to today's edition of the Conversations on Food Justice series. Thank you so much for spending a part of your day with us. I want to start by thanking all of my colleagues at Share Our Strength, and especially Julie McNulty for our great efforts in helping put together the program today. I also want to thank our partners at Food and Society at the Aspen Institute for their tremendous partnership on this series, particularly Corby Cummer, Executive Director, and Mary Castillo. Thanks so much for your ongoing support. I want to note for everybody that we would welcome questions at the end of the conversation and discussion, so please feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A throughout, and we'll address as many as we can at the end of the program. This conversation is timely. Juneteenth is meant to be a celebration of freedom and of our highest aspirations for justice and equity. And it is also a time to reflect on the challenges to justice and equity that remain in every corner of this country. The legacy of economic injustice and the burden of hunger falls heavily on rural communities who, despite producing the lion's share of the food and goods we consume every day, face disproportionately high rates of food insecurity. Today's panelists are having a profound impact on the rural food landscape today, and I'm so pleased that they can join us. Please allow me to introduce our esteemed panelists for today, starting with Beth Brewster, Supervisor of Nutrition Services, Caroline County, Maryland. Dwayne Patterson, Chief Equity Officer, Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation. Matthew and Tia Rayford, chefs, farmers, and founders of Strong Roots 9. Kashi Segal, founder and CEO of Rataza. And my esteemed and wonderful colleague, Sarah Steele, Director of our No Kid Hungry Virginia program, who will moderate this discussion. Sarah, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Elliot. Gosh, y'all, we know that your time is valuable, and we are so grateful that you decided to spend it with us today. And you will not be sorry because we have the best panel ever today ready to talk to you. And they're so extraordinary that I think the best place for us to start today is getting to know them a little better. So, panelists, I'm wondering if you could kick us off by telling us what brought you to this work, specifically the space of rural food justice. And let's start with Kashi. Kashi, are you good to begin?
Love it. Yeah, happy to begin. So, what brought me to this space? Um, I've been working in around the world in poverty and hunger education, and have really been thinking about the environment for a long time. So, a lot of these issues were spinning around in my head, but this thing in 2020 hit called the pandemic, and we saw food being thrown out by the tons of pounds. Farmers were throwing out produce by the tons of pounds, and our neighbors were lined up at food banks in record numbers. And, specifically what brought me to rural parts of the state is working with our farmers to try to figure out why food was being thrown out and why we were having such a hard time getting it to our citizens. So Georgia is an agriculture state, and most of our farmers are not in metropolitan areas. So that's what brought me to rural parts of the state.
Who else? Thank you, Kashi, so much for that introduction. We're glad that you're here. How about let's go to Beth. Beth, do you want to jump in?
Absolutely. My name is Beth Brewster. I'm Food Service Supervisor for Caroline County Public Schools. We're on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. We are the third poorest county in the state. So what brought me to rural Maryland is I got a position here, which I love. I've been in the position for 13 years, and 1 in 4 of our children are food insecure, and it really became noticeable during the pandemic. But we have really tried to make sure that we are feeding our children during breakfast, lunch, after school programs, summer and weekend backpacks, just because the need is so great. We really did see that during the pandemic when we went out door to door to deliver, where we had homes. One house didn't have a roof; they had a tarp, and there was two families living in um, that that home. So we really saw the need, and it just made us more aware of what our children were lacking.
Thanks, Beth. Thank you. And thank you for the good work that you do in Caroline County. How about Matthew and Tia? I'll leave it up to y'all to tell us about you.
Tia, you go ahead, sweetie.
Okay. So my reasoning for being in rural Georgia, I think, is multifaceted. Um, I fell in love with my culinary school sweetheart. Matthew and I both attended the Culinary Institute of America. And when we met in the late 90s, farming was not something that we really talked about. We talked about wanting to be chefs and wanting to, take over the world from a culinary angle. So what in my journey, I spent a number of years working in fine dining and then found myself at a crossroads in regards to how my personal relationship with food started to shift. And this was about 12 years ago. Right around that time, I had also started working as a director of culinary for a very large food service company that had a number of locations across the country that were K-12. So as I was going through my health journey and starting to, I come from food, and it really started to connect with me, the connection between what children were eating in school lunch programs and the end result at the end of that. So there was a deeper connection with making sure that the next generations are eating healthy, know how to cook, know how to reach healthy food and have that access. I ended up taking another couple of years working for a James Beard winning chef, Mark Vetri, in Philadelphia, as his culinary director for his nonprofit that at the time was focused on um, consulting relationships with schools, whether they were on or not on the National School Lunch Program, teaching children about healthy eating habits and the connection between what you eat and how you feel. And I was developing recipes in school lunch programs that everything was from scratch. So we're teaching not only the employees in the kitchen, there's more to it than just the typical school lunch that you see in America, but we're making risotto for 800 students. That is a reimbursable meal. Through that journey, I started really connecting to where the importance of where food comes from, and that happened to be when Matthew and I reconnected, got married, and I moved to the farm. Um, so it all just kind of came full circle for me in my personal and professional missions in regards to food and where we go from in the next generations, and even this generation, and teaching children healthier food habits. I was also a culinary director for the director of culinary for the division during the pandemic. So the shifting that you saw with trying to feed children, I mean, we had 300 school districts across the country, and every school was making their own decision as to how they were going to service students. So it was remote, hybrid, the pickup meals, everything that every company did to make sure that students were getting the food. That really kind of really propelled it for me in regards to food justice, because a number of children part of going to school is you can eat.
Yeah.
And if you're on a free and reduced program, you might be dependent upon that meal as a parent to be able to feed your child. And knowing that there was a disruptor, as Kashi mentioned, we have a need, but a surplus, and we're not connecting. And once Matthew and I connected, and it became really about the soil and the farm and our mission together. And then, as it turned out, I also have an ancestor who was born in the county that I live in now, 200 years ago, and I moved from Philadelphia to Glynn County. So, from a number of different levels, the justice of food runs through my blood for centuries. So, with that, I turn it over to Matthew to tell his part of the story.
Well, I will just say that I'm as country as they get. I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, but raised here in Brunswick, Georgia, on the coast. And one of the things about being raised here, I was probably my first couple of jobs was working at a Piggly Wiggly or inside of a grocery store. In those days, the vegetable section of the grocery store was quite small. You didn't have all the imports that you have right now and everything. So everybody in the late 60s and 70s pretty much did a lot of, you traded cucumbers for tomatoes and things like that. So I didn't quite grow up with food insecurity, so to speak, even though we didn't have a lot of money. So I was on free and reduced lunch and all of those kinds of things. But I grew up on this farm. This land has been in my family since 1874. I'm the sixth generation to be on it farming. We're growing rice, hibiscus, tomatoes, peppers, watermelons, and all kinds of other things to include things that we now turn into high value value added products so that we can then pour back into our own community by selling the products and still being able to go and do things at farmers markets locally and things like that. So my connection is that this is what I know. This is what I grew up on. And I remember after being in the military and going to culinary school and all those things, when my sister and I talked about returning to the land, the first thing we had, just about everybody we came across to say that we were going back home to farm, the reaction was, who would want to go back home to do that work, that slave work, that work that our ancestors were brought here to do? And that was like, whoa. I was like, how does the world eat without farmers? And I didn't know that there was a stigmatism that was in rural communities about farming. Everybody in the rural community wants to go to a city to do something or go to the city to do, we still call it going into town still today. Anybody that lives out in Brookman unincorporated, when somebody goes, oh, where are you going today? Everybody always say, I don't care what career. Oh, I'm going into town to do this. I'm going into town to do that. So being rural for me was just like a way of life. And that's the way people ate. And that's the way they did things. Really quickly on the input from the pandemic, there was such a galvanization of small farmers in my area. And so I know there was a lot of surplus and things in large farms, but in small farms, when the eggs disappeared out of the grocery store, people bought all of our eggs throughout all the farmers that I know. Like we ran out of eggs quickly. Raw milk became a big thing. People that had never drank raw milk before and were like advocates for nobody should drink raw milk were like, can I get raw milk for my dog and my cat? Like I was just like, whoa, that's so the world has shifted over the last 3 or 4 years to realize also that rural is where all the food actually comes from for us to really consume and not just all the other things. I know everyone on here really quickly have heard someone say, my dream is to go and live on a farm. When in the history of the United States in the last 40 years has that been a conversation? I'm going to retire to a farm and I'm going to be able to feed my family and I'm going to be able to do that. So I think when we start thinking about rural communities, rural communities are where it's at. That's where the food comes from.
Rural is where the food comes from. That is incredible framing for us, Matthew, Tia. Thank you. And Dwayne, we'll end with you on this opening question. What brought you to this work?
I think the idea of being able to connect the social justice lens to the basic survival of folks, food, clothing, and shelter is a racial equity issue. When folks are looking at going to the polls, if they're looking at voting, if they're looking at any of the sort of popular things, it is important for us to know that those things are hampered by the ability for people to be able to eat. And even more so in rural areas where um, community is everything, right? And the more we look at the American South, where we do our work, um, rural has always been in, right? The South is, 90% rural. And so we are looking at a reemergence or recentering of the folks that really have been able to move the needle for many communities, behind closed doors. It was mentioned earlier how the pandemic underlined that notion. But for us, many of the leaders that have led social justice movements have come directly out of these rural food justice spaces where folks are attempting to try to figure out how do we keep food on the table. Even if we look directly at here in the American South, Mississippi is where the words Black Power were first uttered in Mississippi. They weren't in these urban areas. It was in Mississippi. And in Black Power, there were an evolution of a breakfast program that was hosted and focused by the Black Panthers. So it has never been separate from a liberation construct as it relates to folks wanting to be free and to get free. Being able to do that in a sustainable way is directly connected to the rural communities and being able to feed ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Dwayne. The rural communities as the origins of so many movements, but also the origins of the food that sustains us, food as a basic need. Thank you for starting us there. I appreciate that so much. And to all of you. So let's do a little bit of myth busting next, because I think we've probably all heard the misconception that it costs less to live in a rural community than it does to live in an urban one. But we don't see that play out in the pricing patterns. And then that misconception also doesn't take into account the barriers that folks who live in rural communities face when trying to access food, right? So studies show that rural residents pay a higher proportion of their income on food than their urban counterparts. And I'd love for us to just unpack that a little bit for our listeners. So the question I have for any of you, please feel free to jump in, is what are some of those barriers and hidden costs that rural residents face as they access food?
I guess I can kind of start that off a little bit because I live literally 15 miles from a town. So I think that a lot of times people don't even think about some basic things like gas. Gas prices are a heck of a lot different in the rural community as they are compared to anywhere else. When we drive up to places like Atlanta, we're always looking over like T and I both are like, how did they get their gas prices down to $2.98 and we're $3.19? Like that, those little things are like things that most people don't think about on a daily basis, but we think about simple things like gas. Those of us that are farmers, the concept of a farmer or someone being in the rural area and farming for themselves or even gardening for themselves is almost a newer concept than an old concept, as like everybody never stopped doing it. So I think that like I know when I grew up here in the 70s and 80s, everybody that I knew had some sort of family little thing, whether it was they only grew tomatoes or they only grew cucumbers, or they only did those things. But then, the grocery stores, as they got larger and people were like, it felt like, oh, the only way I can look like I'm moving forward is if I can shop at a grocery store. So now they're paying higher prices for something that would have been 100 seeds for $2.99. Now they're paying $2.99 for a cucumber or a cucumber and a tomato. So even that concept of having seeds, saving seeds, doing that has almost been washed out of the rural community in very large ways. Tia and I actually worked really hard on doing seed saving here at the farm because what a lot of people don't understand, and Tia put it so eloquently, if it starts with the soil, that means that the next thing is the environment. So we right now have seeds on our farm that we know will grow in 100-degree temperatures that we have here in the South, that we have sent to people in other places that have been like, what did y'all do with these seeds? Like it was a super hot drought summer and they were able to work. And I was like, yeah, because we grow it here in the rural South where those things happen. So I think that that is like one of those things, like something as simple as gas and driving into a city to do all of your purchases of things that cost way more than just a small seed packet would is one of the driving factors. And I know that seems very super small, I guess, but for me, it's a major factor when I look at when Tia and I go to the grocery store and go, it cost us $2 to eat salad all summer. And I'll end with that.
Sarah, I also think transportation in general is an issue for rural America too. I know with us, we don't have public transportation, and people who don't have a vehicle to be able to get there have difficulty getting rides into grocery stores. We only have two in the county, so I do find transportation is an issue.
One thing I'd like to add on to what Matthew was saying, and I'm taking this from the vantage point of someone who grew up in the city, grew up and lived in metropolitan cities up until I was rural. So I see kind of both views, and there is accessibility issues in the cities also. There are grocery stores that are not placed in specific neighborhoods because the interest level of those companies is not there, right? You're not going to find a Whole Foods in West Philadelphia. And for someone to get to a Whole Foods, to get the bus and it's an obstacle. What I think I see here, coupled with what Matthew was saying and Beth also, if you look at Georgia is an agrarian state. It's a lot of agriculture. And then if you look at the economics of what's being grown, we're growing produce. We're growing the return on the ROI on that. There's no ROI on fresh fruits and vegetables. You have to process it. So you can choose whether you're going to sell your corn at the farmer's market or you're going to send it to Kellogg's, right? I'm just using analogies here. Now that box of cornflakes is going to cost way more and shelf stable, and a lot of people just don't have that either the ability to make food anymore. But it's also, if you don't have the financials to return on work that you're doing, and if you're a farmer and there's a 1% profit margin on produce, how does that translate into being able to afford a car, to feed your kids, pay the light bill? It's already difficult enough to make money on it. And then if the crop fails,
definitely not rural. You ain't getting nothing.
You're not getting anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, and how many people live in cities and run farms? There's not. There's no massive farms in large cities. So you also have to look at it from the economic standpoint that the finances of a farm and living rurally and the cost of that versus getting a 2-bedroom condo and Ubering to a grocery store.
And Sarah, just to get back to your question about cost, there's a time cost as well. So what we have seen working in more rural parts of the state, there's a county in Georgia, Clinch County. And shockingly, when we started working there, we found out that it's an 850 square miles worth of a county. It has one grocery store, like one actual grocery store. And from an economic standpoint, that grocery store can charge whatever they want because they're it. And so what we thought was like, oh, for sure, when we went and checked prices at the grocery store, we thought, okay, like we're going to be in line with the grocery store. But in many cases, we were cheaper, the produce that we were selling, because the prices were just shocking. So when we think about equity and living in rural parts of our country, there's a lot to take into consideration, a lot of things that need to be addressed, not just how much is the farmer able to charge for their product or how much is gas, but there's so many different influences that are affecting people's daily lives. Transportation definitely is another one of those. It's just incredibly hard to drive 2 hours to the grocery store. Are you going to do it? You'd rather drive to the gas station around the corner and get a really delicious piece of pizza, So, how do we change some of this infrastructure that exists? There's a lot going on.
Thank you, Kashi. Thank you for naming all those different points of influence. I've heard gas, transportation, wages, the time factor, the inflated cost of food when stores are the only gig in an 850-mile county. Any other thoughts to add on this one?
I think we have to also add in the system. If we look through the lens of the social determinants of health, there's a direct correlation with healthy food and healthy lives. There's a direct correlation with people being able to do better and have more joy, right? Those things are directly connected. And if we are honest, it costs more to be poor in parts of the American South than it actually costs in other places. Like we have the data that supports that. So heating prices are higher, right? For example, places like Memphis has the highest the highest cost for heating your own home, and so we can't discount the system and how it plays out on the choices that individuals make as it relates to wanting to have healthier choices or make healthier choices. You're sort of not sort of, you are boxed in. It is actually a part of the unchecked capitalistic system where it's easier to get a honey bun than it is to get a tomato in rural communities.
Yep.
Because the benefit, it doesn't benefit the consumer. It's benefiting the folks that are selling the honey buns.
Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you for naming all of that. And I think underscoring that point, in so many places, it does cost more to be poor in America. When you think about percentage of income and you think about the availability of those food retailers. And I thank y'all for kind of taking us along through those different barriers and really helping all of our listeners today have a glimpse into some of those challenges. And shifting to our next question, and this is something you've already touched on, rural communities produce our food. They produce so many of the goods and resources that all of us rely on, so many that folks in urban areas that aren't rural couldn't live without, right? But so often the folks that are producing the food have such little control over those resources, the resources that are generated from their hard work, from farming, from the production of food, different factors causing that. Definitely farms being consolidated by corporations. So this is a two-part question. I'd love for Matthew and Tia to talk a little bit about how small local farmers are fighting to regain control in the midst of that environment when so much is out of their control. And then Kashi, we'll go to you then. And I'd love to hear from you how we can do a better job connecting rural communities with the food and resources that are produced in their own backyards rather than being, trucked or trained or shipped out. So Matthew and Tia, we'll start with you.
Go ahead, Matthew.
I'll start off with the thought process that if you live in the country, you got a big old tractor and you got all of this stuff. So y'all should just be able to do it. That is not the factor. I think we forgot to say that rural people are poor or get the world to understand that rural people are poor. So we have learned to galvanize with each other to make stuff happen. So for instance, Tia and I farm 5 acres, solid. We have 50. How do you think that area gets tilled up? It ain't with a tractor. I walk behind a walk behind tiller. Whereas in my urban counterparts have tractors that they get because they have nonprofits that allow that where money can be put into them and given to them to have a tractor. I know folks that have 1 acre, barely, in the middle of the city of Atlanta and have a tractor. I'm trying to figure out how someone gave them money or thought that that was a good thing for the rest of the world when you're not, a lot of times aren't providing enough food for your own community. So I think that that's one of the first things. There's a misnomer on the fact that folks in the South, in the rural areas, have lots of equipment and can just do things and da-da-da. We don't have that. We actually work with other farmers that have small BCS walk behind tillers. We go out and help each other when we're trying to do big areas and stuff like that. That's how we survive, right? Is by partnering with each other. I think, when T and I got married 3 years ago, I think even she coming from a place like Philly and had been to the farm a few times and then saw me actually tilling. I never forget her coming outside and was like, "You've been out here since 6 o'clock this morning. It's 11 o'clock in the afternoon." I was like, "Yeah." She said, "You've been just tilling?" I was like, "Yeah." She was like, "So you've been out here 5 hours just tilling to get the soil ready?" I said, "Yeah." Because we don't have all the infrastructure of a big giant city. So we use what we have to get what we want. But that's the other thing that we are also really good at is fighting our way out of a wet paper bag. Is something that rural folks been doing for so long, that survival in its true terms. Tia has watched me set up our farm to be more of a safe haven for if even other farmers need a place to fall back to help themselves. Because we have hurricanes in our area. So we have farmers that we rely on each other, especially during bad weather areas or bad weather times, to fall back on each other. So I think that that's how we've been able to kind of do some of those things. And it's tough because not everybody wants to work with everybody because, y'all see what color my skin is and how dark I am. I needed extra light on my face so y'all could see me in this video. So that's the reality of it,
A couple things I wanted to add on was, it's interesting how, through the course of history, we look at how this country has evolved from this perspective, where once upon a time it was more expensive to live in the city, it was more expensive to live in the city because you had the land, you had the ability to create a world for yourself that you could benefit from. Whereas now it's completely opposite. It is much more expensive to live rurally and live on your own land and feed yourself than it is to just go into the city and it's almost sad. It's like the easy way, right? It's just the easy way to be able to do things. But to Matthew's point, when we decided to start our business, Strong Roots 9, and start going to the farmers markets, we decided on two things. One, we weren't going to go with produce. We did not want to compete with anyone that had already been there. And we wanted to respect the farmers and those relationships. And I didn't want to be, we didn't want Gilliard Farms or Strong Roots 9 to be known, even for a slight bit, that Mrs. Rayford is from Philadelphia and she's coming down here to sell produce. So we wanted to really give respect to relationships of the farmers that are within our area, but we also started collaborating with them and saying, you know what, we're not going to sell carrots. However, if you've got carrot tops that you don't want to use and you're just going to throw it away, we'll turn it into a carrot top pesto. We'll turn it into a carrot vinaigrette. We'll turn it into carrot vinegar. You know, all these different things. We do that with another mushroom vendor, that a mushroom farmer that's right down the road from us. He'll give us lion's mane. We'll dehydrate it and turn it into a finishing salt. So much like Matthew was saying, there's a lot of relationship building that goes into this because not everybody has the resources to be able to do this. So we might be able to um, borrow the tractor from the farmer down the road, but he might not, he might want, we might have extra chicken or a pork, or, how can we work together to build? And that's how the world should work in the first place. We should be working on building community. We should be sharing our stories. We should be sharing our food. We should be sharing, these are all things that we should be doing anyway. Why is it at a detriment that the things that we should be doing are more expensive and loaded with obstacles? And looking again with Matthew, like a Black woman is, forget it. You're not, you're not even seen in regards to the obstacles. So building that community, particularly around food, is what food is about anyway. So this is how we support each other. We don't intrude. We respect each other. We respect the land. We respect the stories. We find our passion and how we can collaborate with the world and through food.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you, Tia and Matthew, both of you. Kashi.
Yeah, there was a lot there. Yes, there's a lot of money in cities, right? So there are a lot more resources for urban farmers to take advantage of from a equipment and funding and technical assistance standpoint. One of the things that surprised me most when I started my business and I started talking to farmers was that farmers don't set the price for their product. It's crazy. It's determined by a lot of other factors. And I'm saying this because a lot of people here today may not know that it's determined by so many other factors. So one, they're being asked to create a product that they can't even price to cover necessarily all their expenses. And, all the labor, all the inputs that go in. So there's at such a detriment, especially in rural parts of the state. So as we went on our listening tour and really dug in to understand all parts of the local food ecosystem, it was important to me, to us, to start in rural parts of the state, not in the cities, to help connect these local farms to opportunities for more sales opportunities, marketing, helping them get their word out. So how can we connect to food that's being grown in rural parts of the state? Buy local. Like, that is the reason that we exist. One of the big reasons that we exist as a company is to create easier pathways for companies, big companies, small companies, any size company, to buy local food. It's not that you can't buy tomatoes all year round, but when tomatoes are in season in Georgia, buy them from a Georgia farmer. And then when they're not in season and you want to eat that on your salad or whatever, buy it from whoever else you're going to buy it from. But focus on local. You can. It can be more expensive. Farmers markets are pricey. But there's a lot of, one of the reasons that it is so expensive to buy local food is because supply chains get really expensive the shorter you make them, which was also crazy to me when we started. a logistics company, a trucking company wants to drive something as far as possible because it's super efficient for them. The fuller the truck, the longer the route, it's so much better. So what we tried to focus on was, okay, how can we run smaller routes, shorter routes? Our goal is to keep food within community. So can we go an hour away at the very most? We've been talking this whole time about people in our rural communities not being able to access the food grown all around them. So how do we create markets and access and opportunities? And how do we get the local food into schools and childcare centers? And how do we infuse it into the culture of that community just by sales opportunities? You can do it. If you own a business, buy some local food. So they're just decision points all along the way that you actually can make, and it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Thank you, Kashi. I really appreciate hearing both the thoughtfulness from Matthew and Thea around collaboration and respect and partnerships and community, and then some of your thoughts too on the more technical side of things, the supply chains and the markets and the marketing. And so thank you to all of you for bringing those different pieces to that question. I really appreciated that. Dwayne, we're going to go to you. I have a question about philanthropy, and I'm going to read off of my question because I want to make sure I get some of these stats, because we know that philanthropy continues to fall short when it comes to rural communities. And according to the USDA, rural organizations received only 6 to 7% of philanthropic dollars, despite making up 19% of the US population. And things get even worse when we look at those dollars through the lens of pressing issues like climate change. A new report by the Rural Climate Partnership found that while rural areas are responsible for more than a third of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, only 2% of philanthropic dollars are devoted to stopping climate change, in terms of the groups who are working on it in rural communities. So could you tell us a little bit, Dwayne, about what's causing that disconnect and what we need to do to address it?
Yeah, let's go backwards to go forwards a little bit. I think when we are speaking about philanthropy, the part of philanthropy that I work in and that I'm delighted to speak about is the American South. And disproportionately, the American South has the smallest amount of dollars here as it relates to the world of philanthropy. Over 70 to 80% of philanthropic institutions are community foundations, right? We are one of very few that are multi-state or regional, have regional footprint, and we focus on multi-issues. That is almost non-existent in the American South. So when we start sort of unpacking or disaggregating some you shared with it gets even more sharp when you come below the Mason-Dixon, right? And to look at those data points through sort of an unbiased lens would do a grave disservice, right? We have to know that philanthropy as a system is not accountable to anyone, right? And a part of what we have to begin to do as a community is begin to hold each other accountable inside of philanthropy and begin to create a new conversation. Philanthropic institutions don't have to answer to anyone, especially family foundations. I work for a family foundation, and those family foundations, quote unquote, have their own money. So how do you influence or leverage those dollars to have the greatest amount of impact? At the Babcock Foundation, we've been in business for over 72 years. We are really focused on developing real relationships with our grantee partners, and moving a racial equity and power building agenda is front and center in how we do our work. We've attempted to share how we do our work with our colleagues. It is not of great interest for some organizations, especially folks that are not based in the South. They don't understand the need. They don't understand the reason it's necessary for us to begin to do things differently. until we begin to acknowledge and call a thing, this system is designed, is delivering exactly what it was designed to deliver, right? It is not a one-off, right? We have to be clear about that, right? The way the system is designed, you are, as a philanthropic or nonprofit institution, required to only give a small percentage of your corpus or your portfolio, and you are able to maintain a huge set of benefits for those who have established the organization. That is a fallback status that people have enjoyed. And also the cultural impact of philanthropy is that we get to do charity work. We have to disrupt that, right? That this is not about charity, especially here in the American South. This is about centering those who need it the most. And equity means that we have just and fair inclusion in how decisions are made, as well as how the impact or where the impact gets to happen. There are many philanthropic institutions who are not interested in having that conversation at all. It's our dollars, and we get to sprinkle it where we want to sprinkle it, and the rest of you have to figure it out. Even with those who have disproportionate amounts of wealth, they are not interested in funding organizations, funding farmers, funding rural organizations, so those rural organizations can get free. It is about a cycle. There's a magnificent book by some women philanthropic professionals that says that the revolution will not be funded. And there's value in that perspective, right? If we are really interested in feeding people, if we're really interested in folks being more healthy, if we're really interested in doing things differently, we have to begin to attack the core premise of some of these systems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Dwayne, thank you for both naming the system, naming the cycle, naming the ways that it's broken, and thank you for the work that you do to disrupt it. I know that that takes a lot of time and thoughtfulness, and it often doesn't move as fast as folks would like, right? To bring funders along with you, to center the voices of community and not jump to what the quote unquote best practice is, right? So thank you for your leadership, and thank you for that answer. And speaking of kind of disrupting and doing things differently, Beth, I know we just have a few minutes, but there have been some exciting legislative changes at the federal level that just happened that impact the ways that we can reach kids with food in the summertime. And I think this is one of those good examples of saying, hey, the way we used to do it didn't really work. It maybe even didn't make a darn bit of sense. And so I would love for you to tell us about some of those new changes that allow you to connect more kids in Caroline County with food in the summer months and how that's impacting your work.
Yes, so during the pandemic, USDA had made a waiver that we could do non-congregate meals throughout the United States. In 2022, they went ahead and made it a rule that you could do non-congregate meals in rural settings. Last year, they didn't have as many rural areas, and then they redesigned the map this year. Luckily, Caroline County, or unluckily, is all rural, so we were able to do non-congregate meals, meaning we can go into a neighborhood and hand out meals, and the children can go into their homes to eat them before they would have to stay in congregate setting to eat their meal while we watched them. It limited the amount of children that we could service, so it has allowed us to kind of do what we did during the pandemic. We're doing some home delivery. We're going into trailer parks, into housing in low resource areas. So it's allowed a lot more flexibility so we can get a lot more meals out. The other thing is they passed the Sunbucks, the summer PEBT, which allows $40 per child for the summer for children that are on farms or direct certification, which is huge as well. That'll give the parent another $120 for their child for the summer.
Wow.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's very impactful to
Yeah,
bring
it's
that
huge.
in. It's interesting because we in the where we are, the buses only swing through pick up and drop off, and that's it. And the kids are on the bus here at around 6:37 in the morning, and you all know school doesn't start for another what 8:30. So yeah.
That's right. My bus ride was over an hour, and I think it only had 20 kids on it, right? Growing up in a rural area, it takes that long to get to that many kids because you've got to drive the
Yeah.
long distances. And Beth, when you think about the traditional summer meals program, free meals for kids 18 years old and younger, is well intentioned, but it often fell short. The stat is that the summer meals program, the USDA summer meals program, has historically missed 6 out of 7 of the kids who access free meals during the summer months because of issues like geography. If you have a meal site in a town, but you've got to get over a mountain range, and that's a 45-minute one-way drive, hour and a half round trip, and to have to come back and forth every day, that just doesn't work for families, right? So being able to offer multiple meals at once, up to 10 days worth, and then the additional grocery benefits that families can purchase what works best for them, for their households, what they like to eat when we think about culturally respectful foods. So there's just good things happening in the summer meal space, summer often being the hungriest time of the year for kids when school meals come to an end. So we're really grateful for those changes, grateful for folks like Beth who are out there implementing. It is not easy for a decision to be made, at the congressional level, then come through USDA, then come through the states, then come to the program operators. That is a long flow of information. So Beth, thank you for doing what you're doing. And folks, we're getting close to the end here with our panelists. But something that Matthew said at the beginning that I'd love to close on, if you allow me. You talked about those seeds that are growing in 100-degree temperatures and bearing fruit in other places. And that has just lingered with me through this conversation as really a metaphor for rural communities in general, right? The labor and the sweat equity that those seeds have to navigate where they are growing so that food can sustain life, can address food insecurity elsewhere, but also the fact that those seeds are the offspring of mother, father plants that persisted through generations and systems of harm to continue doing that good work of nourishing this country and nourishing the world. So thank you to all of you for the good work that you do. I'm going to introduce Mary Castillo at the Aspen Institute, and just thank you, panelists, for being with us today. We really appreciate you.
And thank you to our stellar panelists for today's conversation on food justice. I'm Mary with Food and Society at the Aspen Institute. And on behalf of my co-producers, Julie McNulty and Faith Adiola at Share Our Strength, we thank you for attending today's session. A quick reminder that yes, we will post the recording of today's webinar, so keep an eye on your inbox or join our COFJ newsletter at aspenfood.org. We hope you will share the recording with your food justice colleagues and have a great rest of your day, and see you next time on Conversations on Food Justice.